I didn't expect anything to change that weekend, not really. I'd packed light, brought my usual sarcasm, and told myself it was just another guy's getaway. Same group, same laughter, same hiking trail tucked miles away from the city where time moved slower and cell signals disappeared. But something felt different before we even left. It was in the way he looked at Neil, like he was waiting for something neither of us had the courage to say. I guess I should start with me. I'm not the loudest in our group of friends. I'm the one behind the camera, capturing moments instead of being in them. I like hiking, coffee that's too bitter, and sketching in the quiet hours of the morning. I overthink things, I know that, but I'd rather sit with my thoughts than say the wrong thing out loud, especially to him. He's been in my life for 3 years now. Since that awkward campus club orientation, where we both hated everyone but ended up laughing together in a hallway. Since then, we've shared too many movie nights, junk food runs, and late-night conversations where we pretended the silence didn't mean more than it did. He's warm where I'm reserved, always quick with a joke or a shoulder nudge. And when he smiles, really smiles, it feels like sunlight landing on my chest. This trip was his idea. 3 days in a rented cabin surrounded by nothing but woods and winding trails. No responsibilities, no lectures, no reason not to breathe. We all needed the break, me especially. Lately, I'd been restless, haunted by questions I didn't want to answer. Questions about him, about us, about why I found myself watching him longer than I should, memorizing the way his hand moved when he talked, or how he bit the inside of his cheek when he was trying not to laugh. When we arrived at the cabin, I pretended not to care when he called dibs on sharing a room with me. Our other 2 friends were already fighting over the bunk beds, leaving us the last room to twin beds, barely 2 feet apart, a small window opening to the woods beyond. The walls were wood-paneled, the floor creaked with every step, and the smell of pine clung to everything. He threw his bag on one bed and collapsed onto it like a kid on summer vacation. "You sure you're ready for 3 days of my snoring?" he asked, grinning sideways at me. I gave a half smile, my heart doing that stupid thing it always did around him. I've survived worse. We unpacked in that comfortable silence we'd perfected over the years, interrupted only by our friends yelling from the kitchen about who forgot to bring the marshmallows. He pulled out his hoodie, gray-worn, the one I'd once borrowed after a cold swim and never returned properly. Just seeing it again stirred something in my chest I couldn't name. That night, we sat around the fire pit behind the cabin. He sat beside me, shoulder brushing mine every time he shifted. The stars above us were bright, scattered across the sky like scattered thoughts I couldn't catch. He kept leaning closer when he talked, like he forgot about space. Or maybe he wanted me to forget it too. When the fire started dying and our friends went inside, he stayed. "I forgot how quiet it gets out here," he said softly, poking at the embers with a stick. I nodded, afraid to trust my voice. "You okay?" he asked, turning to face me. "You've been kind of, I don't know, quiet, even for you." I shrugged, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. "Just tired. City's been loud." "Yeah," he murmured, voice low. "I get that." He didn't press further. He never did. He knew how to leave space for me to come to him, and that made it harder not to want to. The fire crackled. A breeze shifted through the trees. I felt his eyes on me even after he looked away. That night, when we lay in our separate beds, barely 2 feet apart, I stared at the wooden ceiling, listening to his breathing even out. I turned toward him, barely making out the rise and fall of his chest in the moonlight. His face was relaxed, lips parted slightly in sleep, and something in me ached with the weight of everything unsaid. It was just a trip, just a cabin, just a weekend, but I already knew something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. I first met him during sophomore year, tucked into the back corner of a painfully awkward student mixer. He was the only one not pretending to enjoy the forced icebreakers. I noticed his eyes first sharp, but playful, like he was in on a joke. The rest of us hadn't caught. We both escaped that event early and ended up sharing cheap tacos on the library steps, talking about everything from terrible professors to which Peckerman we demarry. He said Gengar, which still makes no sense. It was easy after that. We never had to try too hard with each other. It was movie nights and meme wars, making up fake band names and pretending to argue about who would die first in a zombie apocalypse. He swore he'd sacrifice himself for me. I said I'd push him into the first horde just to get his password. But underneath all that laughter, there was something quieter. Some rhythm between us I could never quite name. I'd feel it when he walked into a room and my chest lifted a little. When we shared earbuds on the bus and he'd closed his eyes like he was hearing more than just music. When his knee brushed mine and neither of us moved away. There were moments, so many small ones, where I'd catch him looking at me like he was about to say something, but he never did, and I never asked. Maybe I was scared he'd say something I wasn't ready to hear, or worse, something I'd always wanted. The morning after we arrived at the cabin, we decided to hike one of the nearby trails, just the two of us. Our friends weren't morning people and were perfectly content, staying behind with breakfast cereal and half-charged phones. He wore that same gray hoodie again, the one that smelled like the woods and faint cologne. I walked beside him, not talking much, just watching how the sunlight slipped between the trees and landed in his hair. "You're quiet today," he said, nudging me with his elbow. "You plotting my death again?" "I'm narrowing down the location," I replied, smirking. "Figured the woods are convenient." He grinned. "Just make sure you post a dramatic eulogy, something poetic." I laughed. Always. That was our thing, joking about everything. Teasing as a way to touch without touching. But even in the middle of all that laughter, there were shifts. Like when we paused to drink water, and he brushed a leaf from my hair, his fingers lingering just a second too long against my temple. Or when I slipped on a mossy rock and he caught my arm, holding it just a little tighter than necessary. Later, we found a small clearing with tall grass and wildflowers, the trail looping off into silence behind us. He sat down with a grunt and tugged his hoodie up to cover his face from the sun. I laid down beside him, our shoulders nearly touching. We stayed like that for a while, the wind whispering through the trees. "I wish we could just stay here sometimes," he said, voice muffled through the fabric. "Not forever, just long enough to forget everything waiting back home." I turned my head toward him. "Yeah," I murmured, "I get that." He looked at me then, eyes soft. "Of course you do." I wanted to ask what he meant, but instead, I just nodded and stared at the sky, feeling the heat of his gaze still on me. That night brought the kind of complication you can't plan for. We'd all gathered in the living room after dinner, playing some ridiculous card game that ended in dramatic betrayals and fake courtroom trials. Our friends eventually peeled off to bed, one of them muttering something about forgetting to bring a proper blanket. I didn't think much of it until we opened the bedroom door and saw the mess. Apparently, one of them had borrowed the extra bedding from our room after losing a bet. The sheets on his bed were gone. The comforter too. Just a bare mattress and a half-hearted note. "Sorry, buddy." It was survival. I turned to him, smirking. "So? Guess you're sleeping on the floor." He narrowed his eyes. "Not a chance. You're the evil genius. You sleep on the floor." We argued for a solid minute, half joking, half stubborn, before he looked at me, his expression shifting. "Or," he said slowly, "we could just share." My heart thud. Dead. Thought the room was quiet. I tried to act unfazed. "It's a twin bed." "Yeah," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "We've shared couches. This isn't that different." Except it was. And we both knew it. Still, I nodded. "Sure." When we climbed under the blanket, we were careful, so careful not to touch. But the mattress was small, and our limbs brushed every time we shifted. I could feel the heat of his skin under the thin fabric. Hear the hitch in his breathing when I accidentally touched his foot. We lay there in the dark, not speaking. My thoughts were a mess, spiraling in every direction, crashing into the weight of every unspoken feeling I'd buried for years. Then I felt it, his hand, barely brushing against mine, not grabbing, not clinging, just there, close enough to notice, close enough to choose. I didn't move away, neither did he, and in that tiny, fragile space between fingers, I felt something bloom. The next day started like any other. We planned to head out early, hit a trail that wrapped around the lake, then stop by the old fire lookout for lunch. It was supposed to be simple, just the two of us again, since our friends had opted for a rest day filled with leftover pizza and bad Netflix choices. The first part of the hike was smooth. We moved like we always did, side by side, tossing pine cones at each other, laughing when one of us nearly tripped on roots. There was a rhythm in our steps, a pattern that felt familiar, safe, and still. Beneath it all, there was that persistent hum under my skin every time he reached out to steady me or casually bumped my shoulder. But by midday, the sky had turned overcast, not stormy, just thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. We made it to the lookout cabin just before the wind picked up. It sat on a bluff, overlooking the lake and the distant curve of mountains. Wooden, abandoned, and surprisingly intact, a relic of the past that still smelled like old smoke and cedar. I stepped inside first, flicking my flashlight against the shadows. Cozy, I joked, eyeing the rickety table and the single dusty bench against the wall. He followed me in and closed the door behind him. Could use a chandelier and a minibar. The wind moaned through the trees outside, and the door rattled softly in its frame. We exchanged a look. "Think we'll be okay here for a while?" he asked. I nodded. Better to wait it out than risk the ridge trail in this wind. He dropped his pack and stretched, shirt lifting just slightly to reveal a sliver of skin at his hip. I looked away too fast. My ears burned. We sat across from each other, sharing granola bars and quietly listening to the wind. For a while, we just talked about school, future plans, how weird it was that we were almost done with college. Then he asked, "Do you ever think about where we'll be in 5 years?" The question hit harder than it should have. I tried to play it cool, like, "If you'll finally grow a beard." He laughed, throwing a peanut at me. "I'm serious." I shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "I don't know. I guess I hope we're still in touch." He tilted his head. "Just in touch." My stomach tightened. "What do you want me to say? That I think about waking up next to you in a tiny apartment? That I've imagined what your laugh would sound like in my kitchen, or how your name would look in my phone next to a heart?" I just gave him a non-committal smile. "You'll probably be off traveling the world, dating someone fluent in 6 languages. Meanwhile, I'll still be trying to keep a houseplant alive." He laughed again, but softer this time. "You'd make someone really happy, you know?" I looked at him, caught off guard. "What makes you think that?" He leaned back against the wall, arms behind his head, eyes tracing mine. "Because you already do." The wind howled louder, shaking the walls. Before I could find a reply, a sudden hard gust slammed the door open and sent dust swirling through the room. We both jumped, scrambling to shut it again, shoulder to shoulder against the wind. He braced the door, while I wedged a rock against it from outside. When we finally got it shut, we were both laughing out of nerves, maybe, but it died quickly, as we realized how cold it had suddenly gotten. And that's when I noticed the sleet, thin, wet pellets slicing sideways through the trees, coating everything in an icy glaze. "Well," he said, rubbing his arms, "looks like we're stuck here for a while." I glanced at the floor. No heater, no sleeping bags, just 2 bodies and a rapidly dropping temperature. "Come here," he said, scooting back toward the bench and patting the space in front of him. Body heat works better if we don't pretend we're too cool for it. I hesitated. Don't make it weird, he added, grinning. Unless you want to. That made my heart stutter. I moved toward him slowly, sitting down where he indicated. His chest was warm against my back, his arms loosely draped over my shoulders as we settled into the makeshift cocoon of our jackets. We didn't speak. His breath was at my ear, his thigh pressed against mine, and with every second that passed, I became more aware of every inch of him. The warmth, the weight, the fact that this wasn't just friendly. Not anymore. Is this okay? He asked quietly. I nodded, afraid my voice would betray me. I wanted to lean back into him. I wanted to reach up and thread my fingers through his, but I didn't. Because if I crossed that line, if I broke the fragile rhythm we'd built over years of dancing around this, there might be no going back. And still, I couldn't help the way my body leaned into his dot. His hand slid slowly across my arm, fingers grazing my wrist. It felt deliberate, not casual, not careless. And when I glanced sideways just a little, his face was closer than I'd expected. His eyes flicked to my mouth and back again. He didn't say anything, neither did I. But in that charged silence, everything felt louder. My heartbeat, his breath, the thousand questions running through my head. Does he feel this too? Does he want more? Or is this just comfort, just warmth in the cold? Hey, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Can I tell you something stupid? I turned toward him slightly. Yeah, he licked his lips, nervous. I've always wondered if you'd ever kiss me first. My breath caught. I couldn't speak. I could only stare, and in that moment, half frozen, half on fire, realized the truth wasn't hiding in my chest anymore. It was all over my face. His words lingered in the air like fog, soft and heavy and impossible to ignore. I've always wondered if you'd ever kiss me first. I couldn't breathe for a moment, not properly. My mind stalled, heart stammering in my chest like it had forgotten how to beat in rhythm. My eyes searched his, looking for a joke, something playful, to undo the weight of what he'd just said. But there was nothing light in his gaze. Just rawness, hope, fear. He was serious. I swallowed hard, mouth suddenly dry. My fingers twitched where they lay between us on the bench, not quite touching his. Why would you wonder that? I managed, barely above a whisper. His smile was small, tired, because I guess part of me always thought you might want to. But I didn't know how to ask without messing everything up. I let out a shaky breath, eyes drifting down to our hands. You could've? No, he said, almost instantly. I couldn't. Not back then. Not when I didn't even know what I wanted, or what you felt. It was just easier to pretend I didn't notice the way you looked at me sometimes, or how I felt when you laughed, or how I'd get jealous when you'd talk about someone else. He laughed, bitter and low. God, that sounds dumb. It doesn't, I said quickly. It doesn't sound dumb. My voice cracked. My chest ached. And all I could think was, why didn't we talk about this sooner? The cold in the lookout cabin felt distant now, a ghost of a sensation behind, the roaring of blood in my ears. He was still pressed against my back, but his body had gone still, like he was bracing for something, a rejection, a retreat. I turned fully toward him, needing to see his face, needing him to see mine. I wanted to, I said, finally. So many times. His eyes flicked up to mine, and he blinked like he hadn't expected that answer. I wanted to kiss you first, I said again, firmer this time, but I didn't. Because I was scared. Because you were my best friend. Because if I was wrong, if I ruined everything between us, I didn't think I could survive that. He exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh of relief. You weren't wrong. The silence that followed was soft, fragile, like the moment was holding its breath. And then he whispered, do you still want to? It wasn't a dare. It wasn't flirtation. It was a question full of vulnerability, like he was offering his heart up in both hands. Unsure if I'd take it or run, I leaned forward, just enough to close the gap between us. My forehead rested against his. His breath hitched. I closed my eyes. "I've never stopped," I whispered. His hands, warm and slightly shaking, came up to cradle the sides of my face. Gentle, careful, like I was something breakable. Our lips brushed tentative at first, barely more than a breath in, then again, deeper. His mouth was soft, unfamiliar, yet somehow already known. A memory I hadn't made yet, but had always carried inside me. He kissed me like he'd been holding back for years, like he'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, and was still afraid it wasn't real. And I kissed him like I was learning to breathe again. When we finally pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to mine again, eyes closed, smiling. "That wasn't stupid," I said, voice hoarse. "That was terrifying." He laughed, and it broke something open between us. The tension that had been wound so tight, threading through years of silence and hesitation, finally unraveled. We sat there for a while, knees touching, hands interlaced, like they'd always belonged that way. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a slow back and forth motion that made my skin burn in the best way. "I thought I was imagining it," he said quietly. "All the times I caught you staring, or when you'd pull away too fast after we hugged, or how quiet you'd get when I talked about dating." "You weren't imagining it," I said, cheeks hot. "I just couldn't let myself believe you might feel the same." He tilted his head, eyes studying mine. "You always overthink everything." I laughed softly. "And you never think far enough ahead." "We balance each other," he murmured. His fingers drifted up to brush a piece of hair from my forehead. The look in his eyes made my heart ache, so full of warmth, of knowing. "I don't want to go back to how things were," he said suddenly, voice trembling just a little. "I know this changes everything. And I know we might screw it up, or make it messy, or hell, maybe we're not even ready. But I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to go back." I squeezed his hand. "We're already changed, whether we say it out loud or not." He nodded, biting his lip. "So then, what do we do now?" I rested my head on his shoulder, letting the moment wrap around us like a blanket. "We figure it out," I whispered. "Together." He leaned into me, arms coming around my waist, and I let myself sink into him fully, finally. The cold outside had nothing on the warmth now blooming between us. It was quiet, real, scary, but safe. That night, after the wind had died down and the sleet turned into a light mist, we made our way back to the cabin under the dimming sky. We didn't talk much, but his hand found mine again, and this time, we didn't let go. We didn't need to say more, not yet, but the silence between us had changed, no longer full of what-ifs, but of promise, of beginnings. Waking up next to him the next morning felt unreal, not because anything had happened. We'd just fallen asleep, tangled under the same blanket on that tiny twin bed. Legs knotted, his arm loosely draped over my chest like it had always belonged there. But still, everything felt different. I blinked up at the wooden ceiling, sunlight pooling across the wall, and I could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath against my side. His warmth, his presence, and this soft, persistent truth humming beneath my skin. He chose me. We chose each other. He stirred beside me, groaning a little, arm tightening instinctively, like he thought I might disappear. "You drooled," I whispered, smiling. He cracked one eye open. "Liar." "Okay," I said, feigning seriousness. But your mouth was wide open, and there was this tiny snore situation. He shoved me playfully, groaning. "No, I refuse. You're not allowed to start teasing me already. Let me enjoy the romantic haze for at least 5 minutes." "Too late," I said, laughing softly. He opened both eyes now, gaze settling on me, and just like that, my breath caught again. Because there it was, that soft, private smile. The kind you only give to someone who knows your heartbeat and still wants to stay. "Hey," he said, voice husky from sleep. "Morning, morning." We just looked at each other for a beat. No rush, no pressure. Like the silence had become a comfortable place now. Not something to fear. He reached up and brushed his fingers against my cheek, then let his hand fall to my chest, right above my heart. I keep expecting this to feel more terrifying. It will, I said honestly. Eventually, when we're back in the real world. He nodded. Yeah, but right now, it just feels ... right. It does. We laid there for a while longer, before finally crawling out of bed, limbs sore from the cramped position, but neither of us complaining. He stood behind me while I brushed my teeth, arms slipping around my waist in the reflection of the mirror. I almost dropped my toothbrush. He grinned at my startled expression. Sorry. Still getting used to being allowed to do this. Me too, I said, leaning back into him slightly. Later, while we were helping make breakfast with our friends, we didn't make any grand announcements. We didn't need to. I caught him watching me across the kitchen, and when I raised an eyebrow, he just winked. My stomach flipped, in that ridiculous high school crush kind of way. Afterward, we sat outside on the cabin porch steps, mugs of too strong coffee, warming our hands. The forest was still damp from the sleet, mist curling around the trees like something sacred. So, he said, voice quieter now, what happens when we leave here? I glanced at him, searching his expression. Are you asking if this was just a cabin thing? I asked. No, he said quickly. I mean, I hope it wasn't. I just, don't want to assume anything. I've never done this before, not with a friend. I looked down at my mug, fingers tracing the chipped rim. It wasn't just a moment. For me, this has been building for a long time, and I don't want to go back to pretending. He exhaled in relief. Good, because I don't think I could, even if I tried. There was a pause, not awkward, but thoughtful. He nudged his knee against mine. But this won't be simple, he said. We're not just a couple out of nowhere. We're us, with history, with routines, with people who know us a certain way. I know, I said. And yeah, some people might be surprised, or not surprised at all, but we'll figure it out. One step at a time. He nodded, then smirked. So, are you my boyfriend now? I choked on my sip of coffee. God, you're so bad at this, I said, laughing. He leaned in closer, voice teasing. That's not a no. I shook my head, grinning. It's a maybe if you keep bringing me coffee in the mornings. Done. He bumped his shoulder against mine, and we stayed like that, side by side, looking out at the woods in front of us. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no orchestral music swelling in the background, just the quiet, gentle confirmation that we had crossed a line we weren't going back from, and that we didn't want to. Not anymore. We left the cabin 2 days later. It didn't feel like an ending, more like a beginning, disguised in soft goodbyes and scattered coffee mugs. We packed our bags in comfortable silence, our shoulders brushing now and then. A quiet smile exchanged every time our eyes met. The kind of smile that said, yeah, this is real. Our friends still hadn't caught on. Or maybe they had, and were politely pretending otherwise. Either way, no one said anything when we both lingered by the same window, watching mist curl off. The trees, like the forest, didn't want to let us go. When we finally stepped outside, I paused by the porch and looked back at the cabin. The old wood, the crooked roof, the place where everything changed. He came up beside me and bumped his shoulder against mine. Nostalgic already. Maybe, I said. I don't know, it just matters now, more than I thought it would. He reached for my hand casually, naturally, and laced our fingers together like we'd been doing it forever. The warmth of it melted something in my chest. Cabin magic, he murmured. I'm never doubting it again. The ride home was quieter than usual. He drove this time, one hand on the wheel, the other still brushing against mine whenever he shifted gears. I watched the trees blur past, thoughts weaving between memories and possibilities. What happens now? It wasn't like we had a roadmap. We hadn't even said the word relationship out loud. But I didn't feel uncertain anymore, not in the way I used to. The fear hadn't disappeared. Exactly. It had just changed. It didn't feel like a cliff edge anymore. It felt like standing at the edge of something we were both willing to jump into together. The following weekend, he came over to my place. He brought Thai takeout, and a hoodie I'd forgotten was still technically his. When I opened the door, he didn't hesitate. He just leaned in and kissed me slow and certain, like we were establishing a new routine, one I never wanted to stop getting used to. We ate on the floor, backs against the couch, my sketchbook open between us. He kept drawing stupid little stick figures, adding word bubbles with terrible puns. At some point, I rested my head on his shoulder, and he rested his cheek on my hair. "I told my sister," he said quietly. I turned my head slightly. Yeah, she was annoyingly smug, said she'd known for a while. I laughed into his hoodie. "Smart girl." He shifted to, "Look at me. I want to keep this us. I don't want to pretend we're still in the maybe stage." "I don't either." He smiled and reached for my hand again. There it was, that small but deliberate gesture. A promise disguised in simplicity. He traced slow circles on my palm, and after a moment, he said, "I don't know what the next few months are going to look like, but I want them to include you." I could have said something clever, deflected, teased, but I just nodded, heart full and steady for the first time in years. "They will." A few weeks later, we went back to the cabin, just the two of us this time. It wasn't planned. We'd been sitting on his rooftop, talking about nothing and everything, and suddenly he just said, "Let's go back." So we did. The same trail, the same crooked porch. But everything was different now. That night, we stood outside under a sky full of stars, so clear, so endless it made my throat tighten. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on my shoulder. "This place feels like the beginning," he said. I turned in his arms. It was. He looked at me then, eyes darker in the moonlight, but filled with something deep and sure. "Whatever happens next, I don't want to forget how this started. I want to keep choosing you." I didn't need anything more grand than that. No big speeches, no declarations shouted into the night. Just him, just that. "I'll keep choosing." "You too," I said. We kissed beneath the stars, soft and slow. No longer uncertain, no longer afraid, just us. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real stories begin. Not with fireworks or fanfare, but with two people, finally brave enough to say yes to each other, to the unknown, to a love they almost missed, but didn't, because sometimes all it takes is a playful fight, and someone who holds you like they never want to let go, and never will.